Good evening and welcome to tonight's Tuesday training webinar. Tonight we're going to be focusing on Finance Committee overviews. I'm Paul Eichelberger. I'm the conference treasurer of the Baltimore-Washington Conference. And I welcome everybody to what is now our third webinar. I'm coming to you live from Fulton, Maryland. And I have a couple folks in the studio with me tonight who will be helping me through the webinar. I have Dr. Smothers, and he's the Director of Leadership and Congregational Development. And I really appreciate Rodney being able to coordinate these webinars for us to be able to bring content and resources to those who are leading our local churches. And also from our communications group tonight, I have Eric Alsgaard and I have Micah Jones. I appreciate both of your help as well. So during the course of the webinar, I know that we're going to be taking some questions. Are there any directions on what the people will need to do for giving us questions?
They will just simply look at the bottom of their screen and there's a Q&A button. And when they press that, they can enter their questions.
Terrific, terrific. Look forward to being able to answer any and all questions that if we don't get to them during this webinar, then they'll certainly be able to use your contact information for being able to get answers back to you. Some questions that I get are questions that I like to give a lot of detail on, so I might actually choose to answer quickly on the webinar and then give you more details personally after the webinar as well. But I look forward to sharing the chance to ask questions tonight. I also think that I've aimed this presentation a bit towards providing you with resources so that you can get some of the general content associated with finance committees tonight. And then the slide presentation especially, you can identify some different web pages and some different books that you might want to look at after the webinar to further your information on each one of these topics. My personal information is on the slide that you may have seen when we came into the webinar. I wouldn't mind putting that slide back up so that we can have everybody write down my email address for you to be able to send me a note directly. And I also have my cell phone number on that slide as well. And folks are good at home at seeing my slide? Very good, very good. Well, thank you. Please feel free to contact me with any questions out of the webinar. And this is good information. I share my cell phone with everyone when I do training so that you can easily give me a call at any time. I'm here to help serve those who are serving the local churches. I'd like to start with a word of prayer as we get ready to go through the information tonight. Let us pray. Lord, we just thank you for this opportunity to use this medium, technology, to be able to study those things that finance committees need to know in the service to the local churches. We thank you for those leaders in the conference that have actually brought this together. Rodney and Eric and Micah, just pray that you'll be with us tonight as we share this information. Bless this time together, Lord, so that you can continue to do good things in the Baltimore-Washington Conference. And that those skilled servants who are on the call tonight can live into their mission and ministry in their local church, bringing those skills that they each have to these important roles on the Finance Committee. And we thank you in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. Okay, let's go to the agenda here. Talk what we're going to be going through tonight. And the first slide that we have shows that we'll be doing a little bit of resource sharing here with the books and publications. My main topics for tonight are to do Finance Committee overview, and we'll be focusing a lot on budgets as well as the financial policies associated with those committees. As we get towards the end of the seminar tonight, I'd like to be able to go to some websites and show you some of those resources that are available on some of the more significant websites that can help finance committees. I brought with me a couple of the resources that are source documents for me tonight and bringing this webinar to you. First one is guidelines that this is sold by Cokesbury. It's $3.99 at Cokesbury. Finance Guidelines is a very good starting tool for those who are on finance committees. Also associated with the finance committee is Stewardship Guidelines. These are published each quadrennium, and when you look for these online, make sure you're getting the 2017 to 2020 quadrennium for those two documents. Very short books, good reference material, good to get you started. I also have some things that I'd like to point to in the Book of Discipline tonight. So the Book of Discipline is $25 at Cokesbury. It's a very good source document. I kind of recommend that every chair at a local church have one of these. And those who are on the committee, if you really want to see some of the more granular details of the church operation, you can get one for yourself as well. My church always had one provided to our chairs of the committees. That was a good introductory gift for anybody chairing a committee at the local church. I also wanted to bring your attention to a book that's at Cokesbury. It's called Church Financial Records Handbook. This is a book that actually gives a lot of manual record keeping for finance. I really enjoyed this. It's kind of old school to be able to go back and understand what you do manually to record deposits and bank counting slips. They've got things here for your stewardship campaigns as well. And they even go through and do manual journal entries as well. So for some of our smaller churches, this is the way they grew up doing this. And I really like the fact that Cokesbury has a document that allows you to see that manual type of transactions associated with finance. I believe if you understand how to do it manually like this, then a lot of the computer systems that try to simplify those types of transactions become a lot more easily, it's more easily accommodated in your church if you know what your simple steps are just by doing manual records. So that's those are those key books. The next slide shows some publications that I would recommend for you to have in your library if you're going to be on the finance committee and trying to do some advancements and continuous improvement at your local church. Ministry and Money is a good book. The Business of the Church is one. These are books that kind of focus on the management of the finances as well as budget, HR types of management as well. It has a little bit of trustees involved with the business of the church as well. The Church Money Manual is a good book. And I also have on this slide Legacy Churches. Legacy Churches is a pretty good book for those churches who, it helps churches that might be in decline to figure out what is their purpose at that part and time in a church's life in which they might be making hard decisions on whether they continue as a church or whether it's kind of a step-by-step process for figuring that out with your church leadership and your congregation. So Legacy Churches. Last book that I bring to you is on the next slide, and that has this is what I would say is the all-comprehensive resource for a church treasurer. I've often told groups that I teach that this is a very nice gift from a church to a new church treasurer. It's one of the most comprehensive books that I know. Richard Hammer is the author of this book. He's with Christianity Today, I believe. And he's a very good authority on both the legal aspects of church as well as taxes and clergy taxes especially. I would highly recommend this book it gives you resources if you're clergy and you're wanting to understand your clergy taxes better. It also does a lot when it talks about different aspects of employee business expenses for a church, charitable contributions, designated contributions, how to deal with those. All of these cases that are listed on this slide are things that he goes into great detail and gives good examples on each one of these things that are being brought for further study. So those are the resources that I bring to you tonight. We'll go ahead and get started with some of the material that we've got. So I'd like to start with a little bit of the Finance Committee overview. First content that I have is to make sure that you understand who's on the committee. For knowing who's on the committee, I look to the Book of Discipline, and I'm in paragraph 258.4. And on this slide, you'll see all the people who are participants in the Finance Committee: finance chair, the pastor, pastors, or the lay leaders, the chair of the church council, chair or representative from the SPRC, pastor parish relations committee. A representative of the trustees is on the Finance Committee, as well as a chair of stewardship. A lot of churches may not have a separate stewardship committee, and that's kind of just molded into the Finance Committee responsibilities, if that's the case. A lay member of the annual conference is included on the Finance Committee. And then by position, Finance Secretary, Treasurer, and Business Administrator are also on the Finance Committee. If they're paid positions in any of those three responsibilities, then they're on the committee without vote. And then the church has the ability to add additional people. A lot of times people know of the finance chair and then that bottom line, the others who are determined by the church council. And they're not fully aware that other leaders of the church are considered parts and parcel of the Finance Committee. In fact, when you look at this list of participants, you'll see that the overlap with the church council is really quite significant. So if you're the chair of a Finance Committee, I like Finance Committee chairs to be very sensitive to the fact that they are involving a lot of the church council leaders directly on their Finance Committee. For that purpose, I think it's good for a Finance Committee to have a mix of face-to-face calls or face-to-face meetings mixed in with conference calls, so that they're not always face-to-face meetings at the church, realizing that these other leaders who are designated to be on the Finance Committee aren't going to too many meetings. I think that it's also very critical for the Finance Committees to be very activity-based. Activity-based to me means, what are the key elements in the life of the Finance Committee in which you need to gather all of the key leaders in order to vote on new things? For me, at the conference level, we get together with our CFA 5 times a year, face-to-face. Excuse me. And face-to-face for us includes the key elements of the first thing that we'll do is set an assumption for the next year's budget. And we'll do that in about October of the prior year. We'll set a expectation of the assumptions in October. We'll have a first draft of our budget together. This is a little bit different timeline than the church might do it, but there's a meeting in which the church will want to review a draft budget with these key leaders. And then there's another meeting in which you're finalizing your budget. So there's 3 meetings already that you know that you have to do for a Finance Committee to be properly reviewing and approving your annual budget. Once you have the budget in place, I would say that there's either 1 or 2 big meetings in which the Finance Committee is getting together. I would think that you might want to do one mid-year, definitely in about the May or June timeframe, in which you're looking at your budget and you're making recommendations to the church and the church council whether or not you need to make any fundamental changes to the approved budget. That gives you 4 or 5 activity-based dates in which the Finance Committee should get all of these key leaders together. And then what I would recommend is maybe on a monthly basis, it's a much smaller group, maybe the church treasurer meeting with the finance chair and maybe a vice chair and maybe the financial secretary. And they get together and they look at the overall results of the financial performance from the last month. They see if there are any questions, see if there's any immediate actions that they need to bring to the board. But you have that periodic check-in to make sure that that things are still going smoothly, but you're not involving the entire committee. I call that the executive team, and that can help reduce the number of meetings that a finance committee that takes on. Now, when you look at the Book of Discipline, it really is fairly straightforward. 258.4 is a very small section in the Book of Discipline. It's only a couple pages long, and it gives you all of the responsibilities that are associated with the finance committee. And it goes 4.A through 4.H. And I wanted to simply read to you the first line in each one of these separate 8 categories so that you heard them. Some of you might have heard this just for the first time in the reading of these. And some of you may have heard these before, but now something new is going to jump out at you when you hear it. So let me read through those, and I think it's well worth our time to just ground ourselves in what these 8 things are for the Finance Committee. First one is in point A. The committee shall designate at least 2 persons, not of the immediate family, residing in the same household to count the offering. Many of us are very familiar with that one. The second one, the church treasurer shall disperse all money contributed to causes represented in the local church budget and such other funds and contributions as the church council may determine. The third one, the Committee on Finance shall establish written financial policies to document the internal controls of the local church. The fourth one, the committee shall make provisions for an annual audit of the financial statements of the local church and all its organizations and accounts. Fifth one, the committee shall recommend to the church council proper depositories for the church's funds. Fairly straightforward. Sixth one, contributions designated for specific causes and objects shall be promptly forwarded according to the intent of the donor and shall not be used for any other purpose. This is a restricted type of donation. Seventh one, after the budget of the local church has been approved, additional appropriations or changes in the budget must be approved by the church council. Okay, so all changes come before the church council. And then the last one, the committee shall prepare annually a report to the church council of all designated funds that are separate from the current expense budget. So you have your operating account, and then once a year before the church council, you bring forward the accounts for all other activities other than the operational account. I've summarized those activities here on the slide that talk about compiling the budget, submitting it to the church council, develop and implement plans to raise sufficient income. You're going to administer the funds according to the instructions of the church council. It also talked about establishing written policies and then carrying out the church council's directions and guiding the treasurer and finance secretaries. This is a very good list of those summary actions required by the committee. And I've stewed this down to really 2 areas of focus. One's going to be on budget orientation, and one is going to be on policies. Now, the neat thing about policies is policies really don't come out of the Book of Discipline. What I just read you is all the instructions that they give a local church for how to do the finances of your church. And so it's very important that you see inside of these activities of the Finance Committee, the fact that you have to establish your own written policies that are going to govern the transactions of your finances in the church. If that's something you're lacking, we're going to be studying that tonight. And that might be a good area of focus for improvement in your church finances. So let me check in. We're going to jump over to the budget at this point. I'm kind of looking to my crew to see if any questions have come in. There are no questions that we've received at this point. Fair. So we're going to continue our view of the slides. We're going to look at the budgets. So let's look at some of the key elements of a good budget. On my slide 11 here, Eric, I'm on a narrative budget is a pretty important aspect to having a good budget. So the narrative budget creates the vision of the church. It really is taking the things that a finance committee knows they need to put on paper for a budget, but it really gives you the rationale for wanting to understand all the ministries of the local church before you sit down to do the budget. finance committee really does need to have people sitting on the finance committee who have these skills and kind of the fingers into different parts of the ministry within a local church to make sure that those are brought around the table of a finance committee. And this narrative budget allows you to put in words. I highly recommend pictures as well. Really puts pictures onto the page of your ministry and allows you to tie the budget numbers with the types of ministry. And the ministry is lives changed. It's really looking for the way that your congregation is touching people in the congregation and within your community and bringing forth transformation in their lives. It's also looking for what opportunities and challenges are before the congregation. This budget narrative allows you to say, hey, based on our understanding of our community, these are the needs that we have. And allows you to, the budget can be your common place for a congregation to rally behind the ministry of the church. So don't underwhelm this fact that the budget can be that unifying device in a church that allows people to understand what the holistic vision of the church is and how the ministries fit into that vision. For the basic element of a budget, there are three elements that many people are familiar with: the operational budget. It's your simple income from plates and offerings and possibly online gifts. These are then put into expense categories and an operating budget showing your normal expenses for trustee expenses, pastoral care, worship, fellowship, ministry and missions. Those types of expenses are all part of an operational budget. For some of our churches who are actually in building campaigns, they might be maintaining or remodeling a parsonage. Those types of activities require a capital budget. They'll have different forms of income, perhaps. They also, you want to separate the expenses associated with those capital campaigns from your operational expenses. And then there's a legacy budget. Legacy budget allows you, we've already spoken a little bit about this, but there are some donor funds that you receive that are restricted by the donor. They might be for a new building fund. They might be for a cemetery, perpetual care. For whatever reason that might be, these are what are grouped as legacy funds. And it's good for you to understand that the legacy fund expenses especially should not be in your operating budget. Those expenses are going to be paid from either the income on investments for something that might be an endowment type of activity. Churches can come into problem areas when they have expenses that they are considering to be operational, but they're actually using legacy funds for paying those expenses. And so you can keep out of that problem by having, and really think of your budget as being three different budgets all in one. Now, the one thing that you like to do in a budget is to group the budget into committee categories. Doing this allows your budget input to be received from each committee. It allows each committee to own the numbers that are actually submitted into your budget. It also is very helpful through the course of the year. If a committee has given you those numbers, they're the ones who will most understand any changes in what they assumed would be either the income or the expenses of that activity. And so it's best for a committee to be able to come back to you at the end of the day and say, look, this one line item, for instance, if it's trustees, and the trustees come back and they say, we had some repairs that we had to do on the parsonage, and that exceeded our budget for repairs. It's very nice when a committee like the trustees comes back to the church council and says, and we covered that expense overrun for the repairs at the parsonage because the snow removal this year was under budget. And so you've now allowed a committee to own the input into the budget. You've allowed them to monitor the progress through the year, and you've actually allowed them to come back with the solution to the church council. The nice thing is they solved it all within their committee as well, because they didn't have to go ask another committee for help in solving that. That's why I do recommend that all budgets, group them into categories and identify who's going to own each one of those categories for your budget. The last bullet on this slide allows us to say how important it is for transparency to identify the source of your revenues that are being used within your budget, whether they're going to be simply the donor gifts, whether they're going to be fees that are going to be charged for participants in a certain event, whether you're going to actually pull things from reserves, or whether they're going to be from endowments. These are very important things to identify in a budget. When you look at a conference budget, our conference budget actually in each one of our annual budgets that's approved at annual conference, you'll actually see a little footnote beside each one of the lines. And if it's not paid 100% from apportionments, then we actually say what the percentage is that's going to be coming from other activities. For instance, for our rock event, it's a large budget item in our conference budget. It's entirely funded from the fees of the participants who go there and the funds that are raised by churches to send their youth to that event. Those are the types of things that I look for making sure that the congregation that's approving the budget knows the sources of the funds. I have a resource page is the next slide that I wanted to make sure that you were aware of. So this is introducing a slide. There's a lot of content in discipleship ministry. When you get the deck, you can write this down. If you want to take a picture of the screen now, this is a very good place to start. But Discipleship Ministries, it's the General Board of Discipleship down in Nashville, has a lot of content that goes back several years as well, and it's tagged very well for being able to resource different topics. So what I'm showing you here on this slide is if you go in and you've looked for a tag and you're looking for budgets, you'll find different types of activities and resources there to support the conversation that we just had on budgets. I did this simply to be able to go down to their website, and some of the key things that I found under this tag for budgets, building a narrative budget was the first thing that I saw. Third thing that I saw there was giving you a sample PDF to download for a narrative budget. So those were two that I found immediately when I went to that page. I drilled down a little bit further and I found some other content that I thought would be very helpful for us in this conversation. One was the 12-month plan for stewardship in the local church. There's things on the IRS publications to tell you what the do's and don'ts are for charitable contributions to the church, how they get recognized, how the donor intent needs to be recognized by the church. And the last thing that I show you there is 10 things you should know about online giving. I think these are all very important topics. And I give you the resources here tonight to be able to go and dig into those as you might need or feel the need in your local church. The next slide that I had was based on tagline that was capital campaigns. Capital campaigns, when I pulled up a tag for capital campaigns, I found a couple things. First of all, sometimes capital campaigns get into your other pocket at home. It's looking for something that might be more of a planned giving type of gift, something that it might be either a business windfall that came into your family. It might also be an inheritance that you've recently received. So that's what I call the other pocket. The Foundation for Mid-Atlantic is very good about talking about planned giving. This resource on the Discipleship Ministries had a planned giving brochures. And there are several different elements of the planned giving brochures that they could download there and be able to hand out to your congregation. We talked about policies a little bit. It has here a sample gift acceptance policy. A lot of other activities there as well for capital campaigns. So those are pretty important places to know where you can go to get resources, especially as we're talking about tonight on budgets. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on some of these budget activities. Rodney, is there anybody that's got a question for us tonight?
Well, we do want to remind our listeners that your slides will be available tomorrow. So if they want to review the information, it will be downloaded for them tomorrow on the conference website.
Very good. Okay, thank you. I'd like to go into a little bit more detail on what it means to have a donor restriction on the funds that are given to a local church. Effective in January of 2018, so just last year, there were guidelines for CPAs was simplified to some degree, and it identified only two classifications of assets for financial reporting purposes. And these are for use by the nonprofits that receive donor funds. So the two categories now are known as either without donor restrictions. These are items that come to you as being unrestricted and can be used for any operational expense in the church, or it comes with donor restrictions. This is formally the temporary restricted and permanently restricted category. So there are some things that fit into this. This could be just a campaign at the local church where you're raising funds specifically for one cause. I have a retention wall at my church right now that is raising a capital campaign during the month of November and December. That this will be our end of year campaign, and we need to raise $25,000 for a retaining wall. When those funds come in, I consider those to be restricted in the nature of the way that was asked. The way that the ask was provided to us was if they exceed that amount, they're going to allow the excess to be put into an operational funding. This year we're running a little bit short, so we know that there's a target for us to be able to do some to care for a shortfall in our operational offerings. So that's ask was specifically done that way in order to understand that the first part of that ask was restricted. If we get the full 25,000 for the retention wall, anything that comes in above that is no longer restricted. It will be unrestricted and it will be allowed to go for operational expenses. Churches can do that. Some churches have done that formally as a policy of the local church, that all capital campaign requests that they have can use excess funds that are gathered to be used for operational. We don't have that necessarily in our policy as a standard policy. We simply incorporate that into each one of our asks at our local church. The importance of that is to make sure that funds don't get unnecessarily restricted for things that either you've already done the project, or restricted for projects that no longer have an importance to the church. And I want to walk through with you on the next slide what that means to have money that is set aside and restricted, that the church has gathered, that for a purpose in which the church has decided that it's no longer needed. So I'm working with a church right now that is actually following every one of the steps that's on this slide. They had a capital campaign probably about 30 years ago, and they gathered about $600,000 to do a building fund. And they were going to build a new wing to their church. And now 30 years later, they still have the money that's been invested and it's gained value. And they purposefully want to make sure that they know what the rules are regarding the restrictions associated with that. So this slide allows you to go down through there, and it separates first the difference between designated funds and those that are restricted. So let's talk about designated funds first. They are unrestricted assets that are voted by the local church council to be used on a particular purpose. So the stipulation can be changed by the local church council. An example of this is funds that come into a budget. Budget actually is a designation fund. You've budgeted aspects of your budget to say, we are going to designate a certain amount of this to go for the pastor's compensation. If the pastor compensation gets changed, then the board designates it again, designates it differently. If you had a project, for instance, that the trustees wanted to let's say that you're going to replace a sidewalk in front of your church. They identify what the cost is of that project, and they designate in their budget how much money it's going to take to do that sidewalk. If at some point they change their mind and they don't want to do that project, they simply undesignate those funds and will put it towards something else. As long as they haven't asked the congregation to give specifically to the sidewalk, then there's no restrictions associated with those monies. But the question is, if you've asked for money for a specific project, can that restriction be changed? And you need to have good guidelines for understanding that this is a legal area that you're entering into when you talk about changing the designation of restricted funds. There's a group called the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act that gives the guidelines on this. This is actually identified for each one of the states. So if you're in Maryland, you could actually Google this, and I've done this within the last month. I've Googled this and put Maryland in it, and it comes up with the exact statute that was voted on in the legislature to govern changing designations on restricted funds. It says, two contents. You can only change it with donor consent. So you have to know which family gave the money. You have to know how much money they gave. You have to know when they gave it. In this instance of this church that I was working with earlier last month, the church did not have any of the records. They did due diligence to try to locate the records from when they raised the money 30 years ago, but they did not have any more records that would allow them to understand the actual families. So they went to the second step here. It says with court and attorney general approval. They're actually writing to the state's attorney general to tell them what their case is. And the court is who will determine what the proper action is for that church that no longer needs $600,000 for the building. So they're working through those steps. The court, this statute that's within the state of Maryland does give you some caveats. It does say you can you can change the restriction for small amounts, and for state of Maryland, it's less than $25,000. Or if it's old, over 20 years old in the fund, you can do that without going to the court. I would keep strong records on what your assumptions are, what your decisions have been, but a church council could actually stipulate and vote on being able to change something that was less than $25,000 or more and also older than 20 years old, and be able to change that locally, allowing your notes to be your reference on how you did that. And if you consider making a change, make sure that an expert financial advisor is involved with the decision. And I would also keep good records of that procedure. So that's what's involved if you need to change the designation on any of the funds that have been given to you in a restricted status. The next slide I'd like to give you is a sample budget. A lot of churches don't have a simple way of looking at their budgets. And I wanted to put this example in front of you in case you're a church that doesn't really have a good starting point. This slide gives you a very simple way to think of your different aspects of a budget. When I look at this slide, what I see here first is you're giving a budget proposal that is built on the trends of the past couple years. We're going to be approving the 2020 budget. This presentation of your budget here shows what the actual income was in 2018. It might be an estimated budget for 2019 or an actual budget, depending on when you're approving the final approval for the budget. But it allows you to understand the context of what you're estimating for a 2020 budget. For this church, this would be a very simple income budget projection. Some churches might actually have 2 or 3 categories in there. If you had to break out the difference between, some church might look at this as being pledge income. Some might look at it as loose offering. Some might look at their online giving as a separate line item, just so you had trends for all 3 of those so that you could group them together. Some churches might have income on this line item that would come from operations of church preschools or things like that. So it could be rental of a parsonage. So depending on how detailed your income is, I think it's good for you to categorize the income if it's applicable for your church. In this budget proposal, it simply does that for expenses. So you see here, the expenses are 144 that are being proposed. It gives you the categories that they think of as a high level category and gives you reference points to look back at back years to see what those expenses were. The very simple approach. It allows people to understand the trends that are involved with the church. You can start to ask questions about what things have changed. What happened to the salary? Why did it go from 61,750 up to 6,500? What's happened to office admin that reduced it from 7,000 down to 5,800? So those are the types of things. What are the things that are going on with facilities that allowed you to drop that by some $3,000? And it gives you good conversation, transparency to what people who have assembled the budget were thinking when they were putting it together. The next slide actually gives you the chance to take a look at how an operational budget then relates to these other budgets that you have for a legacy budget and capital budget. You need to develop a picture in your church of this type of format that will keep your columns of the different types of funds separated. And if you do this, you will keep yourself in good order and not be spending down endowment funds for operational expense. So let's go look at this a little bit. The first column, top of it is the revenue, expenses down at the bottom. At the very bottom of that column, you're going to see a fund balance at the beginning of the fiscal year. Based on the activity that was up above, you're going to add, in this case, you're adding $11,000 to that budget at the beginning of the year, and it comes out $52,000 at the end of the year. That's your operational budget in that column. It's there's no income that's being generated in that general fund that's coming from the categories that are on the right. Restricted funds, the plant fund, and the endowment fund. Those are all different categories. They're different budgets. They're different types of categories of funding. If I was to look at the plant fund, that would be like a building fund. And you're saying to yourself in that column, they're going to get $16,000 of new contributions to the building fund, and they're going to have only $11,000 of expense. I'm not sure exactly what that would be on the plant budget, but nonetheless, that's the way that this budget was proposed. In the far right column, you have the endowment fund that has $5,000 of interest income coming in. It has $10,000 of new bequests coming in. So those avenues of income are only spent on the expenses below that. And in this case, $5,000 was put on for worship. It could have been an endowment that was meant to support worship. It's allowing yourself to see then that the endowment fund actually for the year is up $10,000. And at the very bottom, $55,000 balance at the beginning of the year is now $65,000. It also allows you to see the total activity. If you go to the far right column, it totals all funds. It allows you to see the total ministry expense associated with all of these different types of income categories for your local church. Okay, and the last slide that I have for budgets is going to be on a little bit of stewardship here, Rodney.
Great.
This is stewardship. I actually pulled this from the guidelines for Cokesbury. And I took these 5 elements right out of the book. So if you like what you read here, as far as the highlights of stewardship, I think this is fairly simple and straightforward.
Paul, I want to ask you, the information that you have shared is great. What about churches that don't have financial geniuses leading their financial teams?
That can be a setback, and I do get calls like that, where we're called into a situation where they just don't have the key leaders around the table for doing this. Sometimes it's the computer system. I'm in QuickBooks, and I don't have anybody who can do QuickBooks. I would just tell you that a finance committee, if you don't have the talent sitting around your table, a bookkeeper is a good place to start. I've found people who can do QuickBooks bookkeeping for very low cost. And you really do have to have somebody who knows how to put together like we saw here, a budget that has revenue at the top and expenses down below. And I've actually found some value with some local churches who started there with a bookkeeper, got their records in place, and then the finance committee can be taught. If they have somebody who's put them together by a bookkeeper, I believe a finance committee can be the interpreter. They can hear the story that a bookkeeper can bring to them. And I think I think that's the starting point for a church like that.
Well, one of the questions that we get is, can the annual conference help local churches to get this done?
So I meet with finance committees to do that, to get started. But the activities itself, because you really have to know all the transactions going on at a local church, you have to solve that problem at your local church. Conference can't do this for a local church. Conference can help you understand the types of resources necessary. It can help you understand the types of systems that are out there. But there's really a lot of ownership that local churches and pastors are entrusted to find out how to make that work.
That's helpful.
It doesn't help everyone. but I believe that I think that's how we're organized. I think that's the right, the ownership, and it really is a local church resourcing issue to own all of those aspects.
Okay. Well, one of the questions that we have from one of our listeners is, what about the taxes and 941 preparation?
So a lot of small churches who pay just for the local pastor have the option here for a 941 taxes. So first of all, 941 tax is a quarterly report that's provided to the IRS for payroll taxes. And usually what you're doing on a 941, each quarter you're submitting to the IRS the funds that have been withheld from your employees associated with their state and federal income taxes, as well as their Medicare and their Social Security payments. But a lot of our local churches have just the local pastor involved. So let me speak to them first. So GCFA, the General Counsel on Finance and Administration, has a letter for those who are small churches with only one pastor as their employee. That means that you only have one W-2 that you're submitting, and it is a option for the pastor to have their federal and state income tax withheld from their pay. If the pastor chooses not to have federal and state income tax withheld from their pay, we also know that clergy are self-employed status for the IRS, so they do not pay the payroll tax of Social Security and Medicare. And so for those local churches who do not withhold taxes, they really have no purpose of the 941. And the GCFA has a letter that a small church can have on file that says they are no longer obligated to a 941 quarterly report, where they're filing a report and also giving funds to the IRS. So that's the first thing that I teach. For those who have more complicated tax situations, where they have more than just the pastor being paid, and where they might have laity who are being paid, who have payroll taxes being taken out of their pay, as well as federal and state income tax. Those churches all fit into this category of having to do a quarterly 941 report. If this is a manual report, it can be done automatically with QuickBooks if you have QuickBooks payroll. A lot of payroll services do this as part of their services to a church.
That's great.
Very good. Well, let's continue that. So let's go through the 5 key elements of creating a culture of generous giving. Now, generous giving is one that there's a lot of good books on this. I do like Adam Hamilton's Enough as part of the supporting this type of stewardship focus, but creating a culture where every individual participant in the congregation understands that it's through their generosity and their combined generosity of the congregation that great ministry can be conducted. So the first element in building this type of culture is to have guided self-examination of personal values and priorities. I've actually seen this take place as creating a nice base. It allows people to get around a table and share what their priorities are in life. It allows them to understand, why are they at the church? Why are they at my church? What drew them there? What are the ministries of the church that they support, they find the most meaningful for themselves and also for their communities? And I believe that allowing that to be a group, it's a self-examination, but in a group setting, you can really build a key base for a generous giving culture. Second one would be unapologetic first fruits teaching. I believe that this is the knowing that all the things that we have come from God, that first fruits are paid to God first. And then the leftover is the 90%, believe it or not, 90%, then left over for our own purpose. The opportunity for personal witness inside of this type of a culture is allowing people from the congregation to talk about how the ministries of the church have changed their lives. I believe this is also a tithing aspect. I believe that families can have testimonies about how tithing to a church has changed their lives. It's changed their priorities about what they found important, both the way that they were spending money, the way they were spending their time, and once they get to a tithing culture, what that actually did to shifting their priorities in their life. It's stating clear vision for mission. It's allowing you to know how lives have been changed with the ministries of the life and ministries of the church. And it's also holding high expectations of members. I told you that we were raising funds at my church for a retaining wall this fall. And I was really pleased that when I was putting this slide together, I was able to take these elements of building a generous giving culture, and I put those into the letter. And each one of these elements was brought out by my pastor in the letter that she sent out to the congregation. I was really pleased that the last one especially, it was holding high expectations for each one of our members. It was likening the commitment that we had as members to our church to we had a young lady in our church who just graduating from high school, and she just signed a letter of commitment to a college to play volleyball. And it was she likened that commitment that that volleyball player had to the sport, and now is signing to pledge that kind of commitment to a university to play volleyball. And I really liked how this language here, holding high expectations of members, was brought to us as part of that lesson learned from that experience. So that's a generous giving. For those who are looking at more topics on stewardship, I would send you to Discipleship Ministries. I told you about the taglines to do stewardship. They also have a landing page for stewardship in Discipleship Ministries. This is the landing page for stewardship there. And I thought that there were a couple things that I really liked. When I first pulled it up, one of the first topics I saw was 5 tips for talking about apportionments. Can't tell you how often a local church calls me up and says, hey, how should I be talking about apportionments in front of my congregation? So there's some pretty good tools there. 50 ways to improve your annual stewardship campaign. I believe that these are very valuable resources that are out in Discipleship Ministry. You'll put if you click on there, I have no doubt that you're going to be roaming around and trying to find what other content they have that might suit your purposes.
Great, because we have a couple of questions that you have partially answered in your response. And one of the questions is, do members on the finance committee have to be a member of the church for a year? And if they are transferring from another United Methodist church, can they become the finance chair?
Interesting. We're going to step into financial policies now. And I'll tell you this, I actually had this question. So this might be the same person who asked this question, but this sounds a little different from the question that I was asked just a little bit earlier this month. So I've never had this question, and I've been doing this for 10 years now. So I looked at the Book of Discipline. I don't find anything that says that you have to be a member of the church to be on the finance committee. However, I think there is a practice here that it would be fine, in my opinion, that if a policy were put in place at a local church that stipulated that to be on the finance committee, you needed to be a member of the church. That might be a good policy for some churches. The question that I was asked earlier this month was, we have a gentleman who has all the right skills, but he hasn't given up his membership back at his home church, and he still wants to participate. And my answer to them was, I think you put him on the finance committee, but you don't make him the chair. I think the membership of the church need to know and be very transparent that the members are supporting the other members of a local church. So I think there is a little bit of transparency there. But once again, I would say that there's no book of discipline that will guide us on this one. And I believe it's going to be a local church policy that's going to define what the do's and don'ts are on what your church decides to do in this case.
Okay, this next question is a doozy. GCFA has suggested that the pastor's cash salary can be viewed from the position of a percentage of time spent in the various aspects of the church's ministry. For example, the pastor makes a report to the finance that details they estimate 10% of their time is spent in membership care, 70% in worship, 20% in administration. How can this help, or can this help in preparing a narrative budget?
So I believe that that is a narrative budget. So when you get to your narrative budget and you start talking about pastor compensation and benefits, I believe it's very fair for you to characterize how you view the service of your pastor in your midst. I think the percentages might change between different congregations. I believe that you might also be looking at some churches that have a pastoral staff, and it would be then a staff that you're putting percentage of time that they're focusing on. I think it would actually be a very good exercise to understand what the pastor's contribution is to the congregation. And it might actually be something that you could even put in your narrative budget, what you're asking the volunteers from the congregation to support, and how much you're really counting on them to do other aspects. So for instance, if you had pastor compensation and you started to talk about how much they do on the trustees, some churches, I think, might actually choose. I've been in part of churches where you really want the trustees to step up to the plate and do 100% of the trustee property type of activity in the church. You might actually want that to be part of your narrative budget that says you're going to allow your pastor to focus on these areas, and this is where you're going to supplement the work of the church through volunteer efforts to do these other aspects of the ministry. So I think that would work quite well.
Interesting. What is the length of a stewardship campaign? What should be the length?
Well, some churches don't do stewardship campaigns, so it can be as short as 0. I actually think that a lot of churches who have gone to a generous giving culture consider the stewardship campaign to be year round. And so they don't really put a time to it. And in fact, I would say that a lot of stewardship campaigns might be outdated if you're thinking that it's just a 4-week effort or a 3-week effort. The generous giving reading that I do on the elements that I just showed you really indicates that this is a culture change within a church. And so it becomes more of a year-round focus, and it allows you to be conversant, giving testimonies throughout the year, unabashful acknowledgement that it's through the gifts of tithes and offerings of those members in the congregation that are really making lives, changing lives each and every day. I think that's the new change that we're seeing in stewardship that allows us to take it from that 2 to 3 week focus to being something that we do year round.
Okay. Someone else wants to know, how should stewardship be presented to the congregation? In sermons, Bible studies, or what other formats do you suggest?
I've often been told that it was a good compliment when a pastor was able to speak about money and a treasurer was able to talk about life-changing transformations. And so I think that's the message that we hear there, is that it's a mixture of things that come from stewardship. I think it's very appropriate for the pastor to take leadership on this issue. But I also think that it's very key for finance people to be able to talk about their faith walk and not just talk about money. A lot of people who are on the finance committee just get up in front of a church and ask for more money all the time. And I think the most effective stewardship is when they're able to come up and talk about changed lives. So that's the challenge that I put before churches tonight.
Are churches exempt from unemployment insurance taxes?
Churches are exempt from unemployment. So it comes with a caveat that church employees are also exempt from unemployment benefits. So that is true for both the state and the federal purposes. The churches are exempt from unemployment taxes. What I would say to that is that when you have employees at your local church, it's very important for you to understand that if you do have to let people go, that unemployment benefits are not part of the package that they can garner. And so it's very important for a local church to know that dynamic. And actually, a lot of people, a lot of churches will vote for continuation of pay, continuation of benefits for an extended period after they depart the church, simply for that purpose, to close that gap. By doing that, essentially a church is self-funding themselves. They haven't paid into the pool for unemployment taxes, so there's no pool to be able to pull for these benefits, but you're essentially self-insuring those who have worked for you for that benefit. Okay, let's, the final topic that I really have tonight is talking about financial policies. Financial policies, we talked about this as being the second large category for us. Budget was the first one, financial policies. And we've kind of hinted around this, but the first line says the policies are left to the discretion of the church. So you have to have something to click on to find policies. Once you know that you have to come up with your own policies at the local church, you'll be surprised at how many times, if you Google local church policies, how many churches you can steal from. So this is the best way to go about doing this, is to find some good policies, read through some examples. You don't have to start from scratch. We're going to give you some samples tonight to get you started. So we do recommend starting small. Kind of nice to know. Are there some things that have gone wrong recently within the finances of the church? it would be good to put a policy in place that would address that issue. It's good to think about, in your scenario at the local church, what could go wrong? What are the types of things that you'd like to get control of? Is it the way that the funds get counted? Is there a safe that needs to be involved in your financial policies at the local church? When are the deposits actually made after a service? What happens to midweek offerings and donations that get collected by a church? When do those finally make it to a bank, and how are they safeguarded between now and then? So knowing what could go wrong, knowing what has gone wrong, this will help you identify what the priorities are for new policies. And some important areas for you to consider: counting and deposit procedures, memorial funds. What do you do? How do you make decisions when it comes time to receive a memorial fund? Accountable reimbursements. These are primarily with the pastor and the staff to know what kind of policies you need for receipts and for validating reimbursements. An accountable reimbursement is even a higher level of standard than most businesses have. The IRS has an agreement with churches that a pastor will operate under an accountable reimbursement. And if the rules of that accountable reimbursement as set forth by the IRS are not met, then the income that is received from those reimbursements actually are viewed as income to a pastor if you're outside of the details associated with how an accountable reimbursement is done. So it's very important to know what references we have, and we'll show you some of those references today, talking about reimbursements. Credit card policies, purchase approvals. How does the church operate with a credit card? And then we're going to go into a little bit of detail tonight on church audits. Some churches need to know a little bit more on what's required of church audits, major part of financial policies. So there's a website that I'd like us to go to, and are you able to click on this tonight, Eric? Is that something we're able to do? I'll kind of drive us off the slide. So we're trying something new tonight, folks, by going to the BWC website. Yep. Hey, we're there, we're driving. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what we've done is we've gone to the local church resources. Can you scroll up so that I can see the very top of the page? Okay, so we are on the finance page associated with local church resources. And what we're going to do is we're going to click on local church resources down at the bottom. It's going to bring us to, okay, that's the page that I had on the slide. And Micah, I think you did this for us earlier this year. The internal controls over on the right-hand side are posted. And so we've got, this is going to give you a good start for your church policies. At the bottom of that slide, what I want you to do, at the bottom of that column, Eric, what I want you to do is there's a couple links down there. Now these resources are the links to local church audit guide. We also see suggested retention policies. That's not the one I wanted to click on though. Okay. What's the other one that I wanted to do? I wanted to do the PDF on the internal controls. Yep. Where you got it? It's the very bottom one, PDF version of this list. Okay, I've got 9 policies that are listed on this internal controls. I'm going to review just a couple of them. If you can blow that up just a little bit, Eric, see what you can do there. What I'm going to do is read the number, and then some people might be able to see it on their screen. The third one that I have on this internal controls is, so I read these so that you hear some of them, and you might actually take away that, hey, that's something I want to do differently at my local church. So the third one on this list, all operating, checking, and savings accounts should be under control of the treasurer. Separate checking accounts for church activities should be discouraged. Investment accounts should be accounted for by the treasurer and activity reported monthly to the finance committee. So I hear oftentimes that there are more than one treasurer in a church. Separate accounts set up. Different people put on as signatories for each one of the accounts. This is a policy, and I think this is a good best practice, where all of the church checking and savings accounts that are operational are under the control of the one treasurer of a local church. I think that's important for the transparency of all financial activities at a local church. The fifth one, we'll go down to that one. Very good. This one says the annual administrative board and council should approve the signatories on all church accounts annually. So every year you come in, you say, okay, here's the team of people that we're now going to have as signatories on the account. Some of these accounts never get touched, and people move. Sometimes they get outdated like that. It's very important that a church stay current with who has signatory authority. It's also a good responsibility of the finance committee to know who has each one of these signatories. Number 7 was one that I liked. Quarterly, the finance chairperson should inquire of the treasurer at a meeting as to whether or not all payroll taxes have been timely paid to state and federal authorities. We just had a question on that, on the 941s. So this is asking your treasurer, were all the 941 taxes paid? So can a church get into trouble? That might be a good question. Can a church get into trouble if they don't pay their 941 taxes? Yes. Conference has been called into IRS hearings with local churches who have gotten into trouble. You get into trouble because you've withheld especially if you have lay employees, you've withheld state and federal taxes, you've withheld payroll taxes from their paychecks. And some churches have kept that and not paid them back to the IRS for crediting to those individual accounts. The IRS does not look kindly to that. And so like I say, you can have, if a church doesn't do that correctly, they actually look at the individuals who are serving in the finance committee, and actually that's who we had to go to the IRS with. Finance chair, the treasurer, the financial secretary, and the finance chair. I said, those are the people who would gather around an IRS table to talk about how are you going to repay this money that was incorrectly held by a local church.
One of the questions that has come up is, does that rule about one treasurer apply to United Methodist women and United Methodist men?
Well, so it's a very good point. So there's some real tradition, especially for the United Methodist women. So in the audit guide, you'll understand, and there we have it for one of the later slides, United Methodist women's funds are not part of the local church. They are held separately, and but they still need to follow through on an annual audit guide. And for that purpose, Rodney, I would say that most United Methodist women would say they have their own treasurer because it's their own funds. They belong to the denomination United Methodist Women. I would say that I've heard that United Methodist men probably have taken up that same avenue, but United Methodist men need to understand that if they have a separate treasurer for their account, the treasurer should be very much involved with that funds, because those funds are, through the audit guidelines, you'll see that the United Methodist men's funds are combined with the total funds of the local church in the audit. And so they do need to have direct access by the treasurer directly into those. So I would almost call, in that instance, that's almost like a sub-treasurer that you've identified for the United Methodist men. You've still recognized that there's a treasurer for the church that oversees all of the accounting, but you've subtended some of the responsibilities to a United Methodist men treasurer. It could still work the same way. If we're back to the list, number 8 was one. And number 8, I actually think fits into this category we were just saying. The administrative board, council. How are you doing on pulling that up? Yeah, number 8. The administrative board, council should require and review an annual audit of the church finances by a person other than the treasurer, financial secretary, or finance chairperson. You're looking for independence on that audit. So that's why that's written that way. And the last one that I have is all financial records should be retained in accordance with the appropriate approved record retention policy. And this webpage that we were on has a link directly to the retention guidelines that are put together by the archives. and it gives you a step-by-step approach to each type of financial record that you have at the local church, where it should be held. Should it be held at the church? Should it be held in long-term storage? Some things you have to keep for life, some things you keep for 3 years. So that's what we have for a good starting point for financial policies. Do we have any other questions before I get into the audit, which is the last category I have?
On workman's compensation insurance, what staff and contract workers should be included in the church's insurance?
Say that one more time. So your workers' comp insurance,
Mhm.
who should be included on workers' comp?
Right.
So I'll talk from our experience at the conference level. So if I have a volunteer who's serving at annual conference, we tell our insurance agent, and they include that in our total coverage policy for workers' comp. So we actually, and so this was a new stipulation for us that we just came across this within the last 2 years. And so I would say that this is the question that goes to your insurance carrier, because I think each one of them might see that a little bit differently. When we made the change in our insurance carrier 2 years ago, we were not under the practice of counting volunteers as part of our workers' comp. And then the new insurance carrier started a formal policy of us having agreements signed by volunteers, and that allowed them to be registered as part of our worker comp. And it would be up to the insurance policy to really dictate that requirement. Okay, we'll finish up with audits.
All right.
How are we doing on time? Okay, some of these are a little bit more detailed than others, but I really wanted to get to the point where I was able to show you the procedures for guidelines. But we'll start with slide 23. And on slide 23, we simply read a portion of the Book of Discipline that we already read. It's 258.4D. It's called the United Methodist Book of Discipline assigns the responsibility of the annual audits of financial records to the Committee on Finance. The committee shall make provisions for an annual audit of the financial statement of a local church and all its organizations and accounts. The committee shall make a full and complete report to the annual charge conference. So that's where the report is made to the annual charge conference, and it's a written report. I'm on to the next slide then for 24 that talks about this overview. And as used in the discipline, the annual audit is meant to be a process that provides reasonable assurance that good stewardship is being used in handling and accounting for the funds and other assets of the local church. It's really there to protect church officers. It's meant to build the trust and confidence of donors. It's used as accountability and transparency of personnel activities who are handling the money in the church. And it also provides assurance that restricted gifts are used properly and provide checks and balances for the receipt and expenditure of the funds. So that's the main goal for our church audit guidelines. This next slide actually shows you then the link to the latest version that we have. This was first came out in 2014, and it's at GCFA. Had a couple updates over the years. 2017 in August was the last formal update. I know that they're also looking at this at the beginning of next year to see if they need to do an update in 2020. So it's very current. It describes the audit from start to finish. And I believe that you can take this document and give it to, I believe any of the finance committee members could actually do an audit like this. I really feel strongly that it gives you a clear enough guidance to be able to do a local church audit. What it's going to be focusing on, let's go through some of the content on this. So on the next slide, 26, it's going to walk you through picking an auditor, and it's looking for independence. So not subject to control or influence by anyone who has financial responsibilities in the church. You're looking for somebody who's completely unrelated. And you're looking for someone who's unrelated to anyone who has any of those financial responsibilities to the church. The selection of the auditor and the type of audit will depend on the financial constraints of the church. And what I mean by that is the type of audit that you do is going to be determined by how much revenue you have at the local church. So the audit guidelines are created with the image that for small churches, you need to be able to do this at the lowest cost possible. That's volunteers being able to do a local church audit. That's what this guideline is providing you, is what how a volunteer can do an audit. And the criteria that they provided for us is if you have revenue at the local church less than $500,000, then you simply use this paper audit form for doing your annual audit. You don't have to go out and engage a professional CPA or audit firm to do the local church audit. On the next slide, it tells you what the criteria is. If you have revenue that's in excess of $500,000, then it does recommend that churches do a professional audit. So it tells you that if you're a church that's between 500,000 a year and $1 million, they want you to do an external audit with a professional CPA every 3 years. If you're between 1 million and 2 million, you do that every other year. And if you're greater than 2 million, each annual audit that you do should be done by a CPA firm. So that's part of your transparency. That's part of your stewardship as well, to gauge the size of your audit to the amount of total revenue you have. It's also gauging the amount that you spend on this to the total risk that you have at your local church for the total funds that you're handling. If you're in one of those categories that's greater than 500,000, if you're not called to do the CPA audit that year, then what you do on those off years is you do this paper audit that's done by volunteers. Okay, it's much more, this paper audit is much more of a review than a formal audit. It does have the independence that's required in a CPA review. So it does meet a lot of the financial criteria that would be needed for a good audit.
Someone has asked, should the treasurer, finance chair, finance secretary, and counters all be bonded, or only specific individuals?
Bonding's actually changed a lot since I've known church insurance. So I used to have a policy at a local church where every individual had to be listed by name and what their responsibility was for the insurance company to cover them and bond them. So you would put down the treasurer's name, you'd put down the counter's name, you'd put down the backup counters. And if they weren't a backup counter listed on your insurance policy, they wouldn't be able to count the money on Sunday. So these are called surety bonds. So it's bonding. I looked at a policy with somebody, this was just last week that we did this. It was called a dishonesty policy. So just know that you might actually have to ask your insurance carrier where your bonding is for your handling of money. Now, the bonding is essentially protecting a church against any kind of embezzlement or loss, and you tried to get to the bank and it didn't make it. So most of these are for about $25,000 for bonding, and you're covering those who handle money. Most of these bonds now, if it's a surety bond or a dishonesty bond, whatever it's called in your insurance policy, most of these are now called blanket policies. And what they're doing is they're saying, we're going to blanket your coverage for anybody who touches the funds, and you no longer have to identify by name who those people are. This means that they could have actually positions of responsibility like treasurer or counters or financial secretary, or they could be just volunteers. Somebody who collected the money at the dinner that you had at the church. Somebody who's not known as part of by responsibility, but they just happened to be one of the volunteers that night, and they were collecting the funds and gathering them to give them to somebody else who might have been there to actually lock up the funds and do that. So these are blanket policies, and most of those don't require listing of people for the local church. Okay, finishing up, what I'd like to do, Eric, is let's go to slide 29. 29 gives us some of the groups that are included in the audit. Now, I did read that, and you've heard it a couple times now, that it's all its organizations and accounts. So this slide just helps us focus that is the trustees. Some churches actually consider the trustees as being, they have the legacy of the trustee funds being separate from the operational funds of the church. Just know that this audit guideline says for those churches who are structured that way, that the audit covers all funds. So the trustees have to be included in that. I believe that's the reason why the treasurer of the church has to be on the trustee fund. If that's a separate bank account that you have, the treasurer should have supervision over that account so that they can bring that information into a proper audit. Memorial funds are included, endowment funds. Here's where we have the difference between United Methodist men are on this list, United Methodist Youth, Pastor's Discretionary Fund, Church School. These are all part of the funds that are part of the audit. And then you've got your note here that does not include United Methodist Women, since funds are not owned by the local church per the discipline. Should still be audited annually, but the reports are then separately provided to the United Methodist Women's Organization. And I believe our last slide tonight is going to be information required for the audit. Just a couple things to identify here. We're going to look at the church financial policies. So we know that the church is responsible for creating their policies. So it's those policies now that are going to be formulating part of the basis for your audit to make sure that you're following what you said you were going to do. And we're also, this is one of the line items that you're going to see that the minutes of all of your meetings in a local church are considered part of the audit. This might be the only thing that a church has in front of them that says that the practices followed with good minutes for their meetings is important. I use it all the time at the conference. We need good minutes from our meetings because the auditors are all going to look through it. And you'll see that audit firms look through the minutes to understand what the business activities have been of the conference. They'll do that for your local church, and even the volunteers will do it if they're looking at their paper audit. And those are the things I bring to you tonight on the audit. We finish with just a couple of slides, I believe, that are resource impacts. We're going to try to navigate this GCFA website.
Sure. Let's see.
GCFA legal services is where we're going to migrate to. I'll show you the wealth of activities that we have out there. You can see it on, you'll see it on the slide. You just want to go to the slide and we'll just, I'll be able to characterize what you see there.
You tell me when to stop. Paul. That one?
Nope.
No,
Keep going.
sorry.
Slide 32.
32. I'm going the wrong way.
Okay, there we go. So slide 32, and what I'm going to point to is down in the bottom left corner of this slide. When you get to the legal services, you're going to see a lot of things that we get common questions on in the blue block areas. So you'll click on the top one and you'll go to a group ruling. This is where you go to do your online application for group rulings. Group ruling is simply validating for donors, grant organizations, anybody whose foundations might be asking for you to verify that you're a nonprofit. And if you need to verify you're a nonprofit, just know that the basic is you're part of a group ruling for the United Methodist Church, and Nashville for GCFA is responsible for telling you and giving you a letter that says you're included in their group ruling with the IRS. The other important ones that I see here, GCFA tax packet. Boy, if we were online and we clicked on that, boy, you want to show that?
That's out. It's there.
I don't see it yet.
No?
Click that one over.
Oh, I thought they had it in the share.
If you click on GCFA tax,
Is that
there, we got it finally.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, so here we go. So here's some of the things that you see. I talked about the accountable reimbursement policy. That's up at the top of that. So it gives you sample policies, gives you Q&A about different situations that you run into when talking about reimbursement of employee and pastor expenses. You get down, Form 941 is in here. So that was interesting that was one of the questions. do you have employees or independent contractors in your congregation? So you see a click on that. What else do we have? Form W-2s. It tells you how to fill out a W-2 for clergy. Pretty important when you understand what the housing allowance, how the housing allowance has to be put into a W-2. Also would emphasize that W-2 is how all pastors get paid, that they should not be paid with a 990. Not 990, 1099. 990 is nonprofit. Okay, sorry about that. We have some very good detail that talks about pastors' housing allowance under the Minister Audit Technique Guide. That's what you would find under that. And then tax status of deacons and tax rates and limits, those are all down there at the bottom. I think you'll find a lot of very good, interesting information on all of that information. So let's go back to the presentation and we'll just give you 2 more slides. I've got online resources here for discipleship ministries that talks about job descriptions. The job descriptions that I have, this is slide 33, Eric.
Yeah. Hang on just a second. Where did it go? One moment, please.
And so slide 33, this was a new series that was put out by Discipleship Council. One slide back.
Oh, sorry.
Job description, Finance Committee is the one that I highlighted here. Just know that the slide also has job descriptions for the Stewardship Ministry Leader. It has a job description for the Financial Secretary. It also has this job description for a church treasurer. And in these job descriptions, it lists spiritual gifts and qualifications, the responsibilities of the position, how to get started in that position, the people and agencies that can help. It listed the conference treasurer as one of the first persons for you to call. And I welcome that request. And then it also gives probably 30 to 40 categories of web and print resources for each one of those job positions. And I believe we'll end with the last slide, and that is my pitch for the Mid-Atlantic Foundation. I would just allow you to know that we talked about planned giving a little bit. It's a slide right before that, Eric. And the Mid-Atlantic Foundation is Baltimore-Washington Conference is one of 3 conferences in that foundation. And I really trust the work that they do with planned giving. We talked to you about some of the brochures that are available at Discipleship Ministries, but this is the group that can help you if you're looking at doing anything with an endowment, cemetery funds, building funds, endowments like that, selling a parsonage, turning that into an endowment essentials for pastors. Staying with us through the presentation tonight. Like we said at the beginning, the slides will be out on our website tomorrow. They'll be able to be accessed for being able to review any of these details. I wanted this to be a presentation that really gave you a lot of resources that you can study on your own. If you know where they are, I know you'll be able to find them and make good use of those resources. And I thank all those who were here with us tonight in this room, allowing this to be a ministry of support for the leaders and the congregations in our conference. Are there any last questions before we depart?
Does group ruling apply to incorporated churches as well?
Yeah, so a church can be legally incorporated in the state of Maryland or unincorporated. So churches do not have to be incorporated. That's the starting point. Once you identify that you're a church, that's the key for being part of the group ruling. So Nashville identifies you as a church. It doesn't care whether you're incorporated or not incorporated.
All right, you've answered it.
Very good.
All right, thank you.
Hey, thank you everyone for joining us. Who's up next? Who's in next Tuesday?
Next Tuesday, we are going to have a presentation on the church council, and Pastor Kevin Brooks is going to be our presenter.
Fantastic.
Absolutely.
Thank you for tuning in tonight, folks. Live from Fulton, Maryland, signing off.